Hey, glad to have you back, Sandra, at BTO Range down here in Conroe, Texas. It's December of 2023 here in Southeast Texas. It's a little chilly outside, so I'm rocking the flannel because I just can't get warm. I'm old, I guess. I don't know what's going on with me, but that's the case, so here we are. Today, on our little episode of looking at some older guns, we've got a Remington 1100 here, probably one of the most iconic shotgun introductions of the mid 20th century. Gun was introduced in 1963. Big year for Remington, 1963. A lot of new models were introduced in 63, the 1100 being one of them. And a little bit of history on this gun, on the 1100. In the 50s, in the late 50s, Remington had the model 1148 semi-automatic shotgun in production. We've done a video on that gun. Take a peek at that if you'd like. Long recoil gun where the barrel recoils into the action. And then Remington had developed some gas-operated semi-automatic shotguns, the Model 58, and then the Model 878 after that. And they didn't quite get where Remington wanted to go. I've got a little trying to get over some crud here, so I might cough every now and then. But those had pistons inside the magazine tube. They had quite a few shortcomings, so they turned to Remington's engineer team, the design team led by Wayne Leake, one of Remington's premier designers of the post-World War II era. We've talked about him before. He's responsible for a lot of great Remington designs, including the 1100, the 870, the 742, a lot of that stuff. You can pretty much lay to the feet of Wayne Leake and his team of designers and engineers there at Remington. But in '62, they had it pretty much ready to go, and it was introduced to the public in 1963. So the difference being, and we'll take the fore end off here in just a bit, the piston and the gas system actually operate around the outside of the magazine tube, so that allowed for a couple of different things as opposed to the Model 58 and 878. It allowed for a lot cleaner operation. You didn't have a lot of gunk and grime built up on the inside of the magazine tube and the piston, and causing things to slow down and get gunked up, and then the gun fails to function. And it also allowed the gun to operate, I guess, for the old timers. Well, I guess me too. I guess I'm an old timer. But everybody said it shot softer. So Remington advertising at the time said it reduced recoil by about 55% in the 12 gauge, which was a game changer in both for hunters and for competitive shooters in trap and skeet. And the 1100 went on to become a major competitor in all of those shotgun games. So in '63, it was introduced in 12 gauge, and it didn't take long, I think 64, for it to come out in 16 gauge and 20 gauge, all on the same frame, this 12 gauge frame. This particular gun is a 16 gauge shotgun made in 1965. So it is an early gun in 16 gauge. Remington didn't keep this gun in 16 gauge that long. It went away with 16 gauge in general, went away. Remington brought it back out in the 1100 and in the 870 in the early 2000s for a little while, but it's a different gun. It didn't quite have the same handling characteristics as this one did. So this one, of the 16 gauge 1100s, these 1960s guns are the ones that are typically sought after. So the frame is the same, 12, 16, or 20 gauge in these earlier guns. The frame size is the same. The difference, there's obviously different internal parts: cartridge stops, bolts, carriers, interceptor latches, barrels obviously are different, so that you can't easily convert gauges on these guns, but the receiver size is the same. So that meant in 16 and 20 gauge, these guns were a little heavier than guns that were built on more gauge-specific frames. It translates into less recoil, if you will. It's a little bit heavier gun to carry. So that changed up a little bit later on in 1966, for example. Remington introduced this gun, 20 gauge, a lightweight version in 20 gauge. Frame was still the same big frame. They used lightweight mahogany stocks on the gun, and it was a little bit lighter profile, so it was lighter in weight. But it wasn't until 1970 when Remington introduced this gun in 28 and 410 gauge with a smaller frame, the 28 gauge frame. It didn't take long for Remington to put the 20 gauge out in this gun, in that small frame gun, and it became the 20 LW, and then the LT20 in 20 gauge, and that's one you typically see nowadays. By 1977, it was the LT20. They had a longer barrel extension. They had a different contoured ejection port on the LT20. So the 20 gauge guns deserve a video in and of themselves because there's 3 unique variations in 20 gauge, and it becomes a bit problematic for the shooter nowadays to find extra barrels for it because they do not all interchange. Some will fit but not function well, some won't fit at all, and it can be, and the lightweight 20 gauge barrels on the big frame are almost impossible to find. You pay just a silly amount of money for them when you find them. Back, dang it. Back to this gun, 16 gauge gun, 28 inch full choke barrel, fixed full choke barrel. The rim choke system didn't come around until 1986, so all of these barrels will have a fixed choke marked on this side. So what are we looking for when we evaluate a Remington 1100? Now, there is no way on the planet that we can go through an entire 1100 video in one setting because there's just so much information and so many variations and so much stuff to talk about on the 1100 that we're going to do several of these, both informational videos, and we're going to do some benchtop videos where we take the gun apart and all that type of stuff. So let's just go from back to front on the gun real quick and take a look at what we look at externally when we're looking at the 1100. So when the gun was brought out, Remington was owned by DuPont. DuPont chemical company made a bunch of different polyurethane type finishes. And one of the finishes that they developed for use on the stock was a finish called RKW. And it's a polyurethane finish very similar to what was used on bowling pins. It's a sprayed on finish over impressed checkering, which is what we have here on this stock. So underneath this recoil pad, the recoil pads were fitted, machined, and then the stocks were sprayed. So underneath this, it's not finished. It's not completely finished with the RKW. So if the guns were stood up in a corner and or in a boat, you know, when you're waterfowl hunting or whatever, moisture can get underneath that finish. And you will see on a lot of these older Remington guns, rifles and shotguns alike, you will see the finish start to lift here at the grain, here toward either the butt pad or the butt plate. 1100s were not fitted with pads unless they were the Magnum versions. There is no 16 gauge Magnum. They're all 2 3/4 inch in the 1100s. But 12 gauge Magnums would have had the Remington butt pad, rubber recoil pad, and the 20 gauge Magnums would have. The other guns would have had the plastic butt plate. But you'll see the finish lifting there. So pay careful attention to that. There's really no way to fix it because it's actually lifting the grain off the wood. Stock replacement is usually the only true fix for that. And the issue is there are so many different checkering patterns depending on the age of production of the gun that in order to get it right, you have to find a period replacement stock for the gun. The later style checkering, cut checkering would not be correct for a 1965 gun, for example. So look for that. The white line spacers on the butt plate and on the grip here can crack out and chip out, so make sure those are all the way solid. You should have that white diamond inlay here in the bottom, not chipped out. So one thing pay careful attention to is this gap here on the receiver to the stock. So from the rear of this receiver going backwards out to about here, there is a tube, an action spring tube that comes down here, and the spring that runs the bolt forward lives in that tube. So that tube is brazed into the back of this receiver. It's not screwed in, it's brazed in. Well, it's screwed in, but it's brazed at the factory. And that can bend. And when it bends, or if it gets bent, the link that runs down through here can bind, and that can cause all manner of cycling issues. So the obvious issue with that is if you see a big gap here at the top, it would mean that this stock has bent this way. And that can cause significant action issues. And it may or may not be fixable. We've had some success bending those back. The worst case scenario is it has to be taken out and a new tube rebrazed. That is major surgery for an 1100. So if it, as a general rule, if it has a gap here, if this is not sturdily connected, probably pass on the gun. There is a metal plate that lives between the stock and the receiver, and a lot of times when home users or shooters take the gun apart to clean it, they don't put that plate back. It is necessary to help prevent the stock from cracking. So just make sure that if you do take that apart, you make sure you put all the parts back in it. You shouldn't have any parts left over, I guess is what I'm saying. The ejectors on the 1100, you can see it here through the ejection port. There's this little stud that's affixed to the inside of the barrel extension. Very rarely do you have a problem with this having an issue. It is an integral part of the barrel. It's not something that's designed to be interchanged. But if that is an issue, typically it involves barrel replacement. And finding barrels for some of these guns, like we talked about, can be a bit of an issue. So the forend on the gun, held in place by the magazine cap. A lot of times, if they're not tightened correctly, they can be over tightened, they can be under tightened. We'll see cracks through here. But it's the same kind of finish. Obviously, the RKW finish, the tough polyurethane spray finish, that's done on these receivers. Now, we talked about the 12, 16, and 20 gauge being the same frame size, and the forends can interchange. The 12 gauge forend will fit on a 20 gauge standard frame, but there'll be a big gap here because the barrel is obviously thinner. So there is some parts interchangeability. There are some specific parts, for example, shell latches, interceptor latches, bolts, obviously, things like that are gauge specific. So there are a little bit of variation. Over 4 million of these guns were produced. So there's a ton of them out there, and there's a ton of parts being remade for it. But let's give me just a second. Let me pop the barrel off and the forend off and the barrel off, and let's take a look at the stuff that you should be doing every year on these guns. So give me 1 second. Okay, we're back, and I'm glad I did this. We just got this gun in not long ago. I haven't had it apart yet, but I'm glad we did because that is freaking filthy. So this is the gas system of an 1100, basically. So this is the action slide. The bolt lives on top of that, and then there's a link that goes down to that bar we talked about. But these 3 parts here are what make the gun run, basically. So we can pull those. Oh man, that is hard. It's kind of embarrassing how filthy this is, but it won't be for long, I promise you. This is going to be next on the list, coming through the ultrasonic here soon. So we have the piston seal, and this officially is called the barrel seal. Most people just call it an O-ring because it's a freaking O-ring, but Remington calls it the barrel seal, and that was beat into our heads long ago that we shall not call it an O-ring. It's called a barrel seal because you can get $5.99 for a barrel seal. You can get about 75 cents for an O-ring. I guess that's probably why. But these are the parts that make the gun run. So this guy here is the one you typically have to replace. And it really is use dependent. A lot of people replace them every year. And you can certainly do that, and you don't have to pay that Remington. I don't know how much they are now if you go for a barrel seal, but I don't even know how available they are because the 1100 now is only available in a sporting configuration. It's not really in line anymore. Neither is the 1187, the model that replaced this gun in 1987. But they are available at your local hardware store. If you use Viton, V-I-T-O-N, type O-rings, this would be a size 21 for the 12 and 16 gauge, and 20 gauge standard frame versions. If you have the LT20s, it's a size 19. And the 28 and 14, I believe, use a size 14 in the Viton O-ring. So there's no magic to that. It's an O-ring. You can buy a whole bag of them for just a few bucks, and it'll last you from now till the end of time. But I try to replace them every year on guns that are in use. And we recommend, if you have an 1100, that you send it in to a gunsmith familiar with the platform to have the gun taken apart, cleaned, and checked on an annual basis after you're done with waterfowl season and before you get into dove season the next year. Things can go bad with these. These typically, I mean, they're not stainless. I mean, they're remade in stainless. New Line Guns makes them in stainless. A Remington 1187 stainless parts will work on an 1100. So that's a good replacement idea, to replace these with the upgraded stainless parts and keep this guy new. This keeps gas from flowing forward. Gas operates against this piston and pistol seal, pushes this action slide backwards, pushes the bolt against the action spring, and then ejects the fired case, and then the new shell is released from the magazine tube onto the carrier, trips the carrier latch, and then the gun runs forward again from the action spring on the inside to feed it. So it's complicated. It is complicated. And it requires specific things to happen in a specific sequence in a specific time frame. So the timing of an 1100 is crucial to the operation. So those are some things that that can go wrong with the 1100. And typically, we see this guy going bad is probably the #1 reason why we have failure to cycle on this gun, because there's too much gas blowing by in the front. And you can see that when you look in the inside of the forend, you can see a lot of carbon and soot build up here from that. But we also see some problems just from lack of maintenance, like this gun. This gun has not been maintained well at all. We're going to fix that. But these springs need to be changed periodically. This action spring, again, it's kind of a use-dependent thing. I'd like to see it changed every 5 years if you can. The action spring that lives in this tube back here. And the magazine tube spring. People don't pay attention to the magazine tube spring that often, and it's critical on an 1100 because the 1100 closes, the action closes by the shell coming out of the magazine tube. It has to overpower a carrier latch that lives on a tab on the carrier. And it has to have spring pressure from the magazine tube to do that. So if you have a weak magazine spring that doesn't propel the shell out of the tube with enough force to trip the carrier latch, you could end up with the action locked back and the shell sitting on the carrier. So replacing this tube, the spring inside this tube every few years is a good plan. It's inexpensive. A company called Wolf Springs even makes an extra power spring for this tube. One of the other issues that goes on with the 1100 is the feed latch, or the shell stop, if you will, that lives in the side of the receiver. It's actually staked into the side of the receiver. And it's a spring-loaded piece of steel that keeps the shells inside the magazine tube. When you click them into the magazine tube, it keeps them in there until it's time for them to come out. That can come unstaked from its recess in the magazine and the receiver. And when that happens, that can cause just all manner of feeding issues. So it's an easy repair. Any gunsmith worth the name should be able to do that fairly quickly and easily for you. And the only other issue, and it's unique to the 1100, and we'll go into more detail on these when we take these guns apart on the bench, but the interceptor latch, the timing of this gun is so specific that there are 2 latches. The feed latch that blocks the shell from coming to the rear, and then there's the interceptor latch that comes up behind the rim of the shell that blocks the shell from going forward under inertia and recoil. So it kind of sandwiches the shell rim in between the interceptor latch and the shell stop. So those all have to act in concert at the right time. This action slide has a bevel that causes those things to operate. So all that has to occur at the same time. So it's all engineered at the factory. It's nothing that you have to modify. It's nothing that you have to adjust in the field. But you can wear them out. I mean, it takes a lot of shells to wear out the action slide to where it does that. But damage can certainly do it. The other thing, just like we can bend this action spring tube, we can bend this magazine tube as well. It also is not screwed in to the receiver. That is brazed into the receiver. And it can bend as well. So obviously, any kind of significant bend in this magazine tube, you're going to have feeding issues from the magazine, but you're going to also have problems with the barrel seating onto the magazine correctly, because if you remember what this looked like, that's gunky. Ooh. But let's pretend the gunk's not there. But that fits as a close fit inside this magazine ring here on this barrel. So if this is not in line, then you're going to have a lot more rubbing here. So you can tell that if there's a lot more rubbing there, if this is not running straight and true, then you're going to have a lot slower speed on this action slide, or a lot less impact on this action slide. And then you'll have cycling issues on your 1100 also. So the bottom line of all of that, just babble, is that maintenance. You've really got to maintain these 1100s. Some of it is, most of it actually is well within the realm of the average DIY person, the average shooter, but some of it probably should go to the shop and have a professional take the gun completely apart, clean it, check the interceptor latch spring, shell stops, the extractor tension, the length of the action spring, all that stuff needs to be taken care of. So that said, 1100s are still in use today, that have been in use since the 1960s. There's no reason once we clean this up that this gun shouldn't be able to go out for dove and pheasant this coming year in 16 gauge. I personally like the 16 gauge. I think it's a wonderful gun. As I get older, I see less and less need to shoot a 12 gauge. I'm shooting 16s and 20s more and more and more. So we're going to replace this guy. We're going to clean this all up. We're going to take the gun apart to make sure everything's working. Probably put in a new action spring on this gun, and then it'll be right as rain again, and ready for another 50 years of shooting, I guess, if shooters stay around that long. So if you like what we're doing here, and we're going to do more on the 1100 because there's just a ton more to talk about on these guns, but hit that like button, follow us, subscribe. I don't know what the appropriate terminology here is on the YouTube, but if you have any ideas of something you'd like us to cover, drop that in the comments. We'd be more than happy to do that for you. So again, we appreciate your time and attention, and have a good day.